a tour guide. I'm a tour guide up in Portsmouth. I've been doing tours for 10 years. I've filmed with the History Channel, Travel Channel, New England Cable News. One of the first places that I went to do research was actually cemeteries, to really get a flavor of the cities and towns that I was going to be talking about. Between the epitaphs, the folk art, and just the joy of walking through an old burying ground, as you'll see in tonight's presentation, you can really learn a lot. And sometimes just by taking that closer look at a gravestone, you might find something a little surprising. What I'm going to do is start the presentation off in a really unique way, because a lot of people, when they say, oh, so, you know, what type of tours do you do? What do you write about? You're an author. And as soon as I say cemeteries, some people like kind of like, so you're into that kind of stuff. And it's really my mission to explain to them how amazing cemeteries are. So one thing, as I said, I like to start my presentation with is just kind of a virtual look at some of the cemeteries that are out there and what they have to offer in general. Then we're going to get into some of the superstitions, the beliefs, details on the carvings, some notable stories. But I want to take you on a virtual tour. My favorite cemeteries are colonial, pre-revolutionary. That's what much of our focus will be on this evening. And I visited probably at least 400 cemeteries, pre-revolutionary, all throughout the Northeast and New England. So I'm going to start by just taking you around and telling you a little bit about some of the burying grounds as we do our quick little tour. So this, of course, my welcome screen is the Granary Burying Ground, which is right in the center of Boston, Massachusetts. But cemeteries can be quite beautiful places. So here we are up in Fryeburg, Maine, and with a nice winter coat of snow and just, you know, right in the center of the village. Really nice cemetery there. This one's up in Harpswell, Maine. This is a really interesting village cemetery. It's right behind the meeting house up there. And there's a great story about a woman who, back in the 1700s, the men in town wouldn't allow her to be buried in the common burying ground. In fact, there were a couple of people that were rather vocal after the woman had passed away. And she was actually a midwife. And a lot of men in town were rather jealous of the time that she had spent with their wives, and they insisted that the only way she could have been a midwife was by practicing witchcraft, how she knew so many healing ways with the women. So it was actually the women who carried her coffin from Harpswell to the burying ground, and they implored the minister to have her buried in the cemetery. And the minister said that they actually ended up making a grave of a saint because this woman was so wonderful. But much to the cries of many of the men in the community. And of course, you know, we're back in colonial times. Superstition was rather high back in the day. But Harpswell, Maine is a really beautiful cemetery. This is up in Vermont. Craftsbury Common, another little center of town cemetery. And cemeteries are great no matter what the season. And this is over in Chester. I go to the Chester Public Library just about every year and do a presentation on their great old cemetery. It's one of the oldest in the Granite State of New Hampshire. Another one in Vermont. I just like the name of it, the Old Yard Center Cemetery. And this is, again, back in the 18th century. This is one of my favorite cemeteries anywhere in New England. This is Mount Auburn Cemetery. It's the first garden-style cemetery in the United States, originated back in the 19th century. This is when cemeteries were places to go and visit, and the artwork and the monuments and the breadth of this cemetery is really quite astonishing. I have not seen it all in one day, despite I've gone there so many times. Really a worthy cemetery to go and visit. This is in Providence, Rhode Island. Another brisk winter day, great variety of stones and carvings there, and of course the cemetery is home to the burial of H.P. Lovecraft, whose stone simply says, "I am Providence." This is up in Bennington, Vermont. Here you'll find the grave of Robert Frost, just behind the Congregational Church. This is out in far western Massachusetts. I'm actually from the Northampton area of Massachusetts, so this is out in the Pittsfield area, and you can see to the right of this gravestone you have an in-ground tomb that's been blocked off. In-ground tombs are very intriguing, and we'll get into a story about one in just a little bit. This is right up in my neck of the woods. This is the Great Island, or Newcastle, which was once a part of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Newcastle is home to the Wentworth by the Sea. Yes, this looks like a lovely place to go and have a picnic on a Sunday afternoon, but of course you'd be sitting amongst gravestones, and some people might wonder about you. I might sit beside you. And you know, one thing that I wrote in my cemetery book is that if you could use your imagination and imagine at least one or two people standing in front of every single gravestone, imagine what a crowded cemetery this would be. And that's how a lot of our cemeteries looked back in the 1700s. They became so crowded with stones, it's almost hard to imagine people standing in front of all of them, all those people being underground. It's really quite amazing. This is my neck of the woods. This is Portsmouth. This is the South Cemetery, also known as Proprietors Burying Ground in Harmony Grove. And what makes this cemetery so compelling is it served as one of the two hanging grounds in the city of Portsmouth as early as the early 1700s. So they would actually conduct hangings in the trees there and then inter the people right in the ground. And I just got back a week ago from Martha's Vineyard, and this is over in Vineyard Haven. You can see some of the old ironwork around the family plot here. This really makes a nice view because you can see parts of the ironwork have now gone away, and if you look, the two trees here are starting to undermine the fence work. And it's amazing to find any kind of fence work out there because back during World War II it was rather expected that a lot of your iron would actually be cut down and shipped off and melted down for the war efforts. So it's really kind of a rare thing to find, you know, certainly the door in an entire fenced-in family plot. So this is another reason why cemeteries are so worthy. This is over in Dorchester, Massachusetts. This is a cemetery I just happened to be visiting a few weeks ago, and this is not a statue that you see here. This is actually a red-tailed hawk in a bird bag. Who let me get probably as close as I am to the second row right here.
Wow.
Amazing, amazing. The amount of bird life that you see in the cemeteries, the special types of trees that you see. This is the Forest Hill Cemetery. This came after Mount Auburn by just a few years. It's another absolutely stunning cemetery that was on my list. I never expected to see this right here. And all the little birds were really giving him a hard time and batting him on the head, trying to get him to fly away. But we stood at close range, I'd say about 10 feet, for about a half an hour, and he didn't move. This is up in Limerick, Maine. It's kind of a cemetery just behind the church. And one of the reasons why I show this picture is I talked about seeing what stones lie in the woods. And you can see if you go off into the woods, there's a whole bunch more graves back there. And some cemeteries are definitely more than meets the eye. This is where I'm from. That's my house. Just kidding. That's the Lady Pepperell Mansion. I wish it was my house. It's actually owned by a gentleman from New York who bought it as a summer home. It only cost $1.5 million. This is the Congregational Churchyard. It's our oldest cemetery in Kittery, and it's from the 1700s. This is up in Saco, Maine. I invite you anytime around the end of April, beginning of May, to go up and visit this cemetery because there are over 1 million daffodils that bloom at the back of this burying ground that have been planted continuously since the 1960s. Some of you may have driven by this. This is over at Ipswich. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord. It's a nice bucolic cemetery scene there. Marblehead, one of my favorite cemeteries in Massachusetts, Old Burial Hill. You may recognize the cemetery from a family-friendly movie called Hocus Pocus that Walt Disney Films filmed in both Salem and Marblehead. They filmed some scenes right in this old burying ground. It's an amazing place to visit. And this is a cemetery that I just visited this spring. I really love the inscription on the archway there. This is in Quincy, Massachusetts. This is where President John Quincy Adams was buried, and in fact they disinterred him and buried him in the church across the street. So we went down into the basement of the church and visited both presidents' graves, which was really amazing because there's only 2 churches in the United States that actually have presidents that are buried in them. So this was really a worthy place to visit. You'll notice all of the urns, the funerary urns on the fence too, which is really quite amazing. And this is the cemetery that couldn't be found. This is up in Ackworth, New Hampshire. One of the gravestones actually says that this gravestone marks a particular person's grave whose body is not here because it was stolen. So it marks the grave of a grave robber. And this cemetery literally is out in the middle of the woods. It was near impossible to find, but a very worthy cemetery indeed. There are cemeteries all around us, in our backyards, on the sides of roads, behind grocery stores. They're all over the place. When you think about it, our first burial grounds really weren't the common burying grounds like the one that we have adjacent to the library here. Most people are buried right on their own properties, and of course they used wooden planks if they used any type of marker at all. So we've kind of lost track of where all these people are buried. Oh sure, on occasion they'll be building an exit ramp or, you know, breaking ground for a new house, and they'll come across some bones, but it's sometimes really a lot of work for people to determine who these people are that they're digging up. So just keep in mind, as you know, you're out and about, there's cemeteries all around us. Oh, I love Ben Franklin. Show me your cemeteries and I will tell you what kind of people you have. I think that really stands for several different things in my own opinion. Certainly you can read the inscriptions and read about the people in the community. I think it also relates to the care that the cemeteries get as well, if they're well kept and taken care of. So can't start without Ben Franklin. So all right, so what were the first gravestones? And you know, how come some of our oldest gravestones are, you know, only maybe from the 1660s or 1670s, especially, you know, when we had 1620 in Plymouth and Portsmouth is 1623. Where is everybody else? Well, most people were literally buried with boulders right over their remains, and the whole notion was to keep them from rising up out of the grave. So those are some of our first markers, simply field stones. And I have quite a few examples here. This one's over in the Old York Burying Ground Cemetery that I showed you in the fall, that I said I do tours of. This doesn't look like a whole heck of a lot, but if you look really closely, there's actually 1709 carved in the stone, and there's just a little bit of lettering that's left on this stone to see. Now, of course, if you're walking through the burying ground, you're really not going to be able to read much of it. You may not even think anything of it, but it's actually a grave marker. Here's one that's down in Stonington, Connecticut. And this one you can see is 1690. This is a pretty large stone, and this is called a wolf stone. And wolf stones were used to keep the animals from rooting up the fresh burials. Because back in the day, you know, you had your horses and your cattle that literally would roam freely throughout the community. That's why we had something that were called town pounds. If there was a stray animal, not necessarily just a dog or a cat, they'd be put in the pound. So the animals, of course, would love to roam in the cemetery, and, you know, not everybody was buried 6 feet under. It was basically up to the will of the grave digger and how much he was paid and whether or not he was hungry that night and wanted to leave the cemetery early. So there's tons of stories out there about coffins being exposed after heavy rains where, you know, they were only buried maybe 3 or 4 feet down. So because the graves were so shallow, to keep the animals from digging them up, they used these wolf stones. Here's one in the Point of Graves, which is up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. It's a cemetery that I do tours of. And you can see here, this is a really rough cut stone. It is a field stone marker. You can see a little bit on there. It says, "Here lies ye body of Elizabeth Beck, 1717. And I sometimes find these stones to be a little more poignant in some cases than some of our beautifully carved stones that we're going to look at in a minute, because here you have a personal connection to the deceased. You may have this stone directly off of their property. The person who scrolled on this stone may actually be a friend or a relative. And while they didn't have the means, because gravestones were expensive, they felt that this person should be remembered, and they were going to make every effort that a stone was brought to the cemetery personally by them and placed over the grave. Now here's a tip for you. If you are ever out hiking, walking, biking, in nature, in state parks, wherever you happen to be, and you come across a stone wall, check the stone wall, see if there are 4 sides or at least 3. As you're walking through, look through the brush, because these cemeteries are everywhere. And you'll find some of our earliest cemeteries have stones just like this. They may not have carving on them, But your key is they'll be in rows, or you'll find like a couple together on one side, maybe a couple near the front. You've stumbled on an old cemetery. They're everywhere, honestly. They're all over the place. The few examples that I've given here show what you might find. All right, so this is as technical as we're going to get here. So when you're looking at a gravestone, there's actual terminology to it. The side is the border, the inscription, or sometimes called the tablet. Then of course you have the lunette, which is the curved top, takes its name from Luna, the half moon shape, and then on the borders you have the finial, which is right just above the side above the border. So that's officially what the terminology is when you're looking at a gravestone. All right, so we're going to start with the primitives. Now these may look a little odd to you, but there definitely is a lot of reasonings for why these stones look the way they do. So this one here is known as a cabbage head or a pumpkin head. Those were used initially in the late 1600s and early 1700s. The reason why it's called a pumpkin head is pretty easy to see, that it almost has a jack-o'-lantern style face to it. Now the reason why they call it a cabbage head is the wings, which you can see on either side, those are wings, actually look like giant leaves. So this one here is cabbage head, pumpkin head, early 1700s. This is over in Groveland. There's another one in Groveland, very similar to some of the stones that you have right here in town. I've stopped here a couple days ago and did a walk through the cemetery and got a close look, and there are a lot of similarities there. This one almost has a real simple linear folk art design to it, and stone carving on gravestones is considered to be America's first form of folk art, and you can certainly see why, because these were all carved with hammer and chisel. Remember, we didn't have any fancy machines to do this. You had a stone carver literally sitting there carving the stone by hand. All right, now we're going to get into some really interesting artwork here. This is in Watertown, Massachusetts, and this is more of a rare type of stone that you'll find. On the borders of the stone here, what you have are death imps. Up in the center of the stone, where the lunette is, you'll see there's a death's head, or winged skull, or a soul effigy, depending on what history book you're reading. You'll notice that the two imps each are carrying an implement. One is carrying the hourglass to symbolize mortality. The one on the right is actually carrying the scythe to represent the divine harvest, the harvesting of the life. And we're going to get into why they use these symbols in just a minute. This is another motif that I also found out in the burying ground here. You can find this all throughout Massachusetts, Concord, Lunenburg, everywhere. And it almost has a mystical type of look to it. The spirals that are on here represent the cycle of life, birth, life, death, and renewal. The hex sign that you see on the side is another common symbol that you'll see. In some translations, the hex sign is a protection of the dead. If you go down to Pennsylvania Dutch country, you'll see on a lot of the barns down there, they have hex signs and they have various blessings and belief systems. All right, and the manner of burial back in the 1600s also lasted through the early 1700s and was quite unusual, and something again that you can look for when you're out doing your own explorations. So here, this is a photograph from the Point of Graves, which is up in Portsmouth. You have two rows of stones here. The upper row, they're a little bit taller. The lower row, they're much shorter. And you can see there's a fair distance between the two of them. If you were to draw an imaginary line connecting both stones together on either side, use those lines as bed rails. What you have here is the headstone, which is the stone that's facing away from us here, and the footstone down here. The whole notion was that the person was lying in their bed. So their head would be up by the headboard, their feet would be down by the footboard or footstone. And as I said, this was a tradition that started in the 1600s and lasted, depending on where you are in New England, through the 1700s, some places 1800s. So the thought was that they were taking the long eternal sleep and they were lying and resting in their bed. So you have the headstone and footstones. Lots of ways you can tell that they go together. Well, of course, you have white marble, then you have slate. Sometimes you'll have matching inscriptions or matching artwork on both the headstone and the footstone. So when you're looking at them, bend down and look closely and see if you see anything on them. Sometimes it's just initials. However, unfortunately, in the 1800s, in the interest of burying more people in the cemetery, they would often remove the footstones. So a lot of cemeteries that I've gone in, you'll find the footstones sometimes butted right up against the headstones, and then sometimes you'll find them lying on the stone wall, or sometimes you'll find them under bushes because they really wanted to make space. But when you find them in their original configuration, it's really kind of cool, so you can really see where they're lying. Now, a lot of people in the 1600s were also buried, so they'd be facing east. So when you're standing in the point of graves by these gravestones, you're actually at the headstone, you're facing east. Because the whole notion is that at the day of last judgment, when the Holy Creator appeared, simply everyone would stand up out of their graves at dawn, face the Creator, and be judged. And again, this was back 1700s, and you'll find it shifts throughout New England. So here's the symbology, the different styles that we're going to be looking at. We've already started with the death's head or the winged skull, late 1600s through around 1790. The cherub's head style we're going to look at shortly, 1760 through 1810. The urn and willow style, 1770 through the mid-1800s. Again, there's a shift as you move throughout New England. Some, more of your busier city locations will have the shift a little earlier. Some of your more widespread cities and towns will have the shift a little bit later. So let's talk about the skulls and souls and the symbology on the stones. And this is Elizabeth Pierce. You can see she has a death's head. Her stone is from 1717. You'll see she has the hourglass perched on top of the skull, and that signifies the delicate balance between life and death, that balance. And also, if you look closer at the hourglass, you'll find that all of the sands are carved out at the bottom to signify that time has run out. All right, so let's talk about why they use, such graphic depictions of death. Puritan beliefs, death was inevitable. It was God's punishment for the original sin of Adam. Evil spirits and evil men occupy the earth. In fact, all suffer from utter and unalterable depravity. Death was preached as a reward, at least for the chosen few. Upon death, the soul was released from its earthbound world. The most glorious purpose to which a Puritan could espouse was to work to bring God's kingdom home. Some people will receive eternal salvation as a gift bestowed upon by God, but most will face eternal damnation. Hell was preached as a place of unspeakable terrors. And it was impossible to know with confidence if you were among the saved. The best that you could do was examine your life constantly and maintain faith in your own goodness and God's own justness. So how did Puritans respond to the ever-present reality of death? A deep underlying tension characterized the Puritan view of death. On one hand, in line with a long Christian tradition, the Puritans viewed death as a blessed release from the trials of this world into the joys of everlasting life. At the same time, the Puritans regarded death as God's punishment for human sinfulness, and on their deathbeds, many New Englanders trembled with fear that they might suffer eternal damnation in hell. So, when we're looking at these stones, think about the time frame now, 1700s. Most people couldn't even read. And in a world where we didn't have artwork hung on our walls, there wasn't a lot of imagery in our lives. These were images that everybody could understand. The images of the death's head, the images of the death hymns. And the whole notion was, as you were to walk by these gravestones, you were to contemplate your own existence on earth and all those thoughts that we just covered in there. Were you being a good person? Were you bringing God's kingdom home? You were to examine your own life by looking at these gravestones. So this is a gravestone that's in King's Chapel in Boston, Massachusetts. Here you have Father Time, and of course you have death there, and they're extinguishing the flame of life. And it's really a very interesting cemetery to go visit. It's about an acre big, and it's surrounded by skyscrapers on either side. It's a very fascinating place, full of death's heads and all sorts of imagery like this. And this is, I believe this is late 1600s on this stone right here. This one's over in Salem, Massachusetts. What I find interesting about this one, besides the fact that it has 3 skulls on it, it actually has an unfinished hourglass on the skull that's on the left of the lunette there. So the stone carver never quite finished it. You'll notice too, on this particular gravestone, it says 1708 and it has a /9. That's actually not a mistake. Right up until around 1740, a lot of gravestone carvers would put both years on the gravestone because we had an overlap of the Roman calendar and the Gregorian calendar, and they wanted to make sure that they were right. So in that instance, it's actually not a mistake. So you'll find that on some gravestones. I think it's just carver preference as to whether or not they did that. And here's a nice double stone. You'll find some double stones came after a few people in the family had passed away. It was a little more feasible for some families to have one gravestone carved for several people as opposed to one for each because it was a little bit cheaper. This is over in Newburyport, and of course you can see death there and the dove, which of course means heaven. If you look to the left, you'll see the tools of the grave digger, the shovel and the pickaxe, and it looks like there's some unfinished carving there. You kind of have a coffin and then there's like an indentation there. It looks like he didn't completely finish, but maybe that was the design he was going for. There's really no certain way to know. This is pretty graphic. This is down in Newport, Rhode Island. This was the style of this particular stone carver, where you can see the scythe right around the person's neck. And he did it for men, women, adults, children, and you can see, of course, the giant. You just getting that now? Yeah. Like, where is she looking? No, it's like right here. Yeah. Like he doesn't see it coming. Yeah. And of course, the giant hourglass. Again, mortality time. Yeah, those are all over Newport. Something I haven't seen outside of Rhode Island.
Wow.
This is where I come from. As I said, I was from Western Massachusetts. This is out in South Deerfield. South Deerfield was a frontier town, if you will, back in the 1700s that was raided time and time again by the Indians, and it's a really amazing place to go visit. And they have their old burying ground, and in the cemetery you'll find a few gravestones by this very unusual stone carver. And the reason why you have the coffin with the mother and child is the mother died in childbirth, as did the child. The way that they were buried, he actually depicted right on the gravestone. The child is buried on the mother's left arm, and you can see that right on the stone. Unfortunately, the stone carver I feel really sad about because he had such a unique style. He ended up in his 30s having some sort of mental illness, and he ended up drowning himself in the local river. I think it was somewhere around the age of 35. So he had a very unfortunate end, but his stones are quite unique and very striking. All right, so the Point of Graves, I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of my favorite cemeteries, I do a lot of tours of. A little bit of the history there. Of course, you can see the very graphic depiction of skull and crossbones on the left there. And the Point of Graves is one of the oldest burial grounds in the state of New Hampshire. It's the oldest common burying ground, dating from 1671. We do have family cemeteries that are older, but this is the oldest common burying ground where people actually started being buried communally. And they say, though, that burials took place here as early as the 1650s, but cemetery documentation is so hard to get from the colonial era. If you can find it at all, it's usually certainly genealogical records, but sometimes kept by the church, if you can find it. So the Point of Graves is a really unique cemetery in the respect that when you come up to the burying ground, and that's Prescott Park in the distance there, you're going to find a very unique entrance. I myself prefer the groaning swing gate, which I really can't make the sound for you, but it's got that old cemetery gate sound, which I love. And then you have this iron turnstile. I mentioned previously about animals grazing in the cemetery. Well, Point of Graves was no different. Horses and cattle would roam in there after the fresh burials. So in order to keep the animals out, instead of using wolf stones, they installed this iron turnstile, which still works. It's still in place today. So as you go in the cemetery, it literally is like walking through a portal in time. It's really quite amazing. So the turnstile is kind of cool. And there's all sorts of amazing stones in this cemetery. More than half of them are original stones from the 1600s, which is, again, anything from the 1600s is pretty rare. What I like about this stone is it's actually signed by the stone carver. I'll give you a second to take a look and see if you can find it. Here and here. C.L. Caleb Lamson. The Lamson family of stone carvers were from Boston, Massachusetts. Very prolific, very well done, very much sought after. And Caleb would hide his initials on the gravestones. You'll find them in flowers, you'll find them on the bottom, but certainly you can find them right here. And this is early 1700s right here. So you saw in the first slide of the pointed graves another stone that looked very similar to this. This was, these are stones that were carved by John Homer of Boston, Massachusetts. He was very much sought after for his lifelike depiction of the skull and crossbones.
Sorry.
It's a call from the dead. Yeah. So, and they are life-size when you're standing in front of them. These stones are huge. 1759 and 1774 respectively. And of course, one thing that a lot of people will say to me when we walk up to these stones is, are those pirate graves? Or then I get other people that are like, those are graves of murderers, aren't they? And I'm like, no, not really. But you could draw a parallel with the pirate flag. Skull and crossbones, Jolly Roger. It's the same message. Surrender or die. Consider your own mortality. Same thing, same thing. Oh, I love this one. This is one of my favorite stones anywhere, Pointed Graves, Portsmouth. This is a child's gravestone, early 1700s, 1718, and if you look at the borders of the stone, you will see raspberries on a vine. Raspberries and strawberries were used for children to signify that they were still ripening on the vine and hadn't come to fruition. So bittersweet, very beautiful, very, very rare. No snow keeps me out of a cemetery, so up in Franconia, New Hampshire, came across this great little cemetery, and I noticed something about this first row over here. There was a row of gravestones on the left, but only one on the right. And I said, that's kind of odd. Well, when I got a little bit closer, I realized why. Here we have the grave of George Maxwell. This is 19th century, and he was put alone in his row, so we're early 1800s here, because he was killed by another man. And on the back of his gravestone, it says who he was killed by. And this man was put to death for his murder. But because the folks were so superstitious, because this man was killed, that they felt that there was bad spirits and bad energy around this man who was killed, the people that laid out the cemetery buried no one else next to him, and that is on record. All right, so the Old York Burying Ground. All sorts of little tidbits I've scattered in there. Again, like I have so many stories, I could be here for days. The Old York Burying Ground, these trees are amazing. You can see they're bright, vibrant yellow. These are sassafras trees. They're actually numbered. They're very, very rare. They're huge. I mean, they're super, super tall. I'd say probably, at least 30 feet tall and amazing. And all the branches bend up like arms. And what I find ironic about the trees that are in the cemetery is if you take the leaves and mash them up, you can make healing balms, tinctures, and ointments, which is what they would have done back in the day. And then when you smell the leaves, it smells like a freshly peeled orange. They're really amazing. And of course, they made sassafras tea. But it's interesting to find them, though, in a cemetery. And they're some of the tallest sassafras trees on record in New England. And they're in a cemetery. What do you think they're using for fertilizer? I know, I hope you had dinner. I'm sorry if you hadn't. But really, think about some of the imagery that we just saw about going back to the earth and that cycle of regeneration. There you have it. You have all the nutrients and everything that's broken down from the body. Calcium, yes, calcium. She's got it, she's got it. All of that going back into the earth. And here you have this visual of everything that's been given back to the earth. For me, it really makes me stop and think. It really, really does. All right, so you're saying, all right, Roxy, so all that hellfire and brimstone stuff, really? Is that really true? Oh, yes, it is. You can read it on some of the gravestones. So this is John Bragdon. He's a promising youth. And of course, his stone really illustrates what his story was. So with him dying back in the early 1700s, the stone, of course, tells you he died in the 23rd year of his age with some comfortable hope in his death, after great distress of soul and solemn warnings to young people not to put off their repentance to a deathbed. It's on a stone. As you walk by, contemplate your own existence on earth. This is, we're still in the Old York Burying Ground. It's a beautiful sandstone gravestone. Unfortunately, it's falling apart because the moisture has gotten into it and it's starting to crack and lift, and there's a pile of sand at the bottom. This stone's actually pretty rare for my neck of the woods because it was made in Connecticut. We don't really have a lot of rough brownstone, sandstone grave markers up in our neck of the woods there. It was shipped up from Connecticut for the Lyman family plot. This is a family plot that's in the back of the burying ground. And unfortunately, it's not holding up to the weather too well. This is the grave that everybody goes to visit in the Old York Burying Ground. This is the grave of Mary Nason. And of course, she passed away at the age of 29 in 1774. Here you can see another gravestone by the Caleb Lamson family of stone carvers. This is a portrait stone here. You can see her hair is all coiffed and really quite dramatic inscription on there. And the stone was commissioned by her husband, who hoped his dust would mingle with hers, etc., and hoped to have been buried right next to her. Unfortunately, he isn't buried next to her against his wishes. But many people believe her to be the witch of Old York. Now, she was a healer, and some people say she performed house blessings. And remember, back in the 18th century, people were really superstitious. They didn't have cable then. So they were into everybody's business. So here is really the reason why everybody was so overly superstitious about her, is because she has this stone over her grave. And everybody says it's the witch stone. It's to keep her from rising up out of the grave. And if you touch the headstone and touch the stone on the ground, you'll find the stone on the ground's warmer, because you're actually feeling her power coming out of the grave. Well, now there's an opening in the trees there. The stone on the ground heats up a little bit more than the upright gravestone, but you know, the other story is a little spookier. And plus, we already know that's a wolf stone right there. There's a story about the good folk of York leaving the church across the street from Sabbath services right around the same time, and the pigs were in there digging up all the bodies. It's a little more interesting, saying, ooh, that's keeping her in. But let me pose you this little tidbit of her story. So, there's a hand-drawn map of the Old York Burying Ground that says, you know, everybody basically in there for many years had these wolf stones. How come hers is the only one that's left? You walk around the cemetery, there's no more wolf stones. Well, I'll just pose it to you. Would you want to be the one to remove the stone that's keeping the witch in the grave? Probably not. So we'll just leave that there. Oh, okay, so it's show and tell time. I love show and tell when I get to tell people that I have gravestones at home. Yeah, then that's the reaction I get. They're like, what are you, insane? This is the stone that you see up on the screen. This is the Susanna Jane headstone. It's up in Burial Hill in Marblehead, Massachusetts. This stone, if I was to stand next to it, is about this tall. So the inscription's all underneath it here. The stone was carved by Henry Christian Geyer, and it was commissioned by Susanna Jane's husband. And I was very lucky to get this actual plaster casting of his gravestone that was taken around 1980. I met a gentleman for a number of years. He had actually gotten permission from cemeteries to go in and make plaster casts of the gravestones, not gravestone rubbings, but actual casts of the gravestones. And he did that for a number of years, again, back late 70s, early 80s. So when I found out that he had the Susanna Jane stone, I said, oh, get one. So I was very excited to get this. And it is a one-of-a-kind stone in the entire world. There is not another stone like this at all. And I'll just kind of walk around a little bit to show you why it's one of a kind. You can see, and again, you can use the slide behind me for reference. You have the bones right here, so we know that bones represent mortality. Of course, we've got the hourglass, and the hourglass we know, time's flying. Now here's something interesting. The Ouroboros, it's the snake eating its tail. You can see the snake's head right here, eating the tail in the circle. Well, of course, that is, again, another symbol of the never-ending cycle. Now, of course, you have angels, and you have very unusually bats on the bottom here, representing heaven and hell. And of course, you have the Grim Reaper, if you will, here. And he has the scythe, and of course, he's cloaked. And he also has the laurels on his head, which means that he has been victorious in taking the life. Now, he holds the sun and the moon, which there's a couple different translations about the sun and the moon. Of course, one translation says it means the New Testament and the Old Testament, and then the other translation that I read said that it meant, the world of the dead, the dark world, and then the world of the living, the light world, whichever one you want to take, feel free. But it's really, really quite amazing. We're going to go to the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening, the intense religious revival that swept the American colonies beginning in the 1720s. Remember, depending on where you are in New England. Attitudes towards death began to change. Where in the 17th century children were told to fear death, they were increasingly told in the 18th century to look forward to death as a reunion with God and their parents. And adults in turn were increasingly assured that a life of active piety assured salvation. So they stopped showing corpses to children. They stopped telling children that their parents would testify against them at the Last Judgment. It's amazing when you read the history and the preachings and the hellfire and brimstone. It's unbelievable. But you also have to remember, at that time we had no modern medicine. The mortality rate was, a third what it is now. And ships came in from all over the world, and they weren't quarantined, and disease ran rampant, never mind Indian attacks. There was a lot going on, so it was a very grim time. But we're going to move into the Great Awakening. The resurrection. So now that the stones get a little more cheerful, except for this one. This is up in Hollis, New Hampshire. Memento Mori, remember death. There's an interesting story about two brothers who were stone carvers. They carved the same exact design of angels. However, one carved smiling angels. The other one carved frowning angels. Some people believe it had to do with their own religious beliefs, where one thought that, death was that blessed salvation, while the other one was still kind of stuck in the past, thinking that, oh, well, death isn't so good. So evidently he's the frowning one. But really, really quite beautiful, very dainty, and it's just interesting when you find both gravestones. Now, I love this guy, and he has to be in every presentation that I do, because this stone carver's name is Zerubbabel Collins. I don't know if you know a Zerubbabel, if you've met one. I haven't. Great name. He was from Connecticut, ended up in Vermont, and look at the masterful work he did with a hammer and chisel. This is also during the period of the resurrection. I love that we have the little colonial wig going on there, which a lot of the men would wear back in the day. You can see right up there, right over his, all curled up. And of course, all the flowers and the scroll work. This is on white marble, which is in impeccable condition. But yeah, it's a really great design. This is in Plymouth, Massachusetts. So here we have the resurrection now. If you think Plymouth, all right, big seafaring community. We have a coffin floating in the ocean. Oh. They died at sea. So here you have the trumpeting angel signifying the resurrection. But you also have the floating coffin. This is up in Hampton as well. Unfortunately, the time and weather has kind of taken their toll on the borders of this stone. But again, here's another with the curly wig hair there, just moving into the resurrection. This is in Connecticut. This one's in Mystic. And very interesting designs you'll find down there of their angels. They have this like electrified halo design. It's really quite amazing. They have hair that just kind of comes out. But really beautiful. Again, consider the shape of the stone. This one's 1787. Port of Graves. Gotta go back there again. This is Elizabeth Lear. She was wife of Captain Tobias Lear. Tobias Lear's son went on to become the personal secretary for President George Washington. Tobias is buried in the cemetery. Coincidentally, his son, after serving President George Washington, committed suicide. I don't know why. I'm researching to try and find that one out. But this is a beautiful design that actually is right out here in this cemetery as well. It is. It is.
The pretty eyes. And
well, at night they don't look so pretty with my flashlight on because this is the gravestone that kind of just follows me when I walk around with the light. Like, you can give me skull and crossbones all day long, but this one at night with my flashlight, not so good. Okay, you want to talk amazing. This is down in Newport, Rhode Island again. I had only read about this stone and I had to go see it. Remember the gentleman with the around the neck, with the scythe around the neck? This is some of his other work. And this is one gravestone for 6 children.
oh,
And all the girls are named the same, and they all died under the age of 5. So apparently they kept trying to have children, and it just wasn't working for them. The stone is enormous. It goes probably from here to here. It's huge. So really, really quite beautiful. One of the biggest that I've seen, although I've seen 4s and 5s. Very rarely do you see a 6. This one's up in Portsmouth in the Old North Cemetery, which is our other old cemetery. So another design. This one's got a lot going on here. This is for a Revolutionary War general, and you can see he's like really victorious over time because he's got the raised sword, and of course the birds, the doves, and the flowers. Memento Mori, again, remember death. This is up in Concord, New Hampshire. Same time frame, different take though. I really find this one very intriguing. You can see on the finials we have the hex signs, on the borders we have the flowers, signify the cycle of life, birth, life, death, and renewal. Here on the lunette, you have the upside down coffin with the diamond that signifies the mortal remains or the body going into the ground. And then you have the heart with the arrow pointing skyward, meaning the ascension. So if you were to read that, you have the mortal remains going in the ground, but the soul goes up, much like the heart being raised up over the death's head that we saw. Speaking of epidemics and things of that nature, this is up in the little village of Antrim, New Hampshire, the Meeting House Road Cemetery. It's up on a very, very steep hill on a dirt road. You're just kind of looking past the stone wall into the woods. But one very striking thing as you walk around the cemetery that you'll see is all of the gravestones for all the children that died in the summer of 1800 because of dysentery. Over 60 children died that summer, almost every single child in the community. So you can see just countless gravestones, August, September of 1800 for children. Just rows and rows and rows of them. I couldn't even imagine what it must have been like in that community. So this is the Phillips Hale Cemetery, and it is literally out in the middle of the woods. And you'll find the plot in the back here with these gravestones, and then you'll see right next to them this chair. So this chair is in the Ross family plot. And the reason why it's there, of course, it faces the west and faces sunset. It's so these spirits, the family, their spirits can sit in this chair, face the sunset, and contemplate their existence on earth. And this is in the Jaffreytown records. All right, so speaking of contemplating existence on earth, we're now starting to move into the early 1800s, and we're getting a little bit into the spiritualist movement now. So now we're going one step beyond the resurrection. So this is the Bowman Mausoleum. It's at the front and center of the Laurel Glen Cemetery in Cuttingsville, Vermont. And there's Mr. Bowman. He is at the door to the mausoleum. There he is. Isn't the likeness amazing? Amazing. So, John Bowman, born in 1816, Clarendon, Vermont, which is just a couple towns away. He learned the tanning business at the age of 15. In his 30s, he started his own tannery business. This is him from the back. When you walk up the steps to go to the mausoleum, you almost think there's someone standing there. He's life-size. In 1849, he married Jenny Gates of Warren, New York. A daughter, Addie, was born in 1854, but she died at the age of 4 months. A second daughter, Ella, was born in 1860 and grew to be a fine and cultured young woman. However, in 1879, misfortune brought an end to his pleasant home life. Ella fell ill and died. Less than a year later, Mrs. Bowman passed away, leaving her husband alone to bear his grief and sorrow. Mr. Bowman resolved to build a memorial and lasting resting place for them in his native Vermont hills. So here we have these columns. Here's a bust here of Mr. Bowman. Now you can see in the back, you're going to have Addie and Ella, and here's the little baby. Now those are mirrors in the back corner there. I want to go to the next. You're looking through at the reflection of the bust of the woman. She's facing away into the mirror, so you're looking at the reflection. So from his vantage point, he's looking through the columns at their reflections in the mirror, which is something called the veil. He's looking through the veil at them on the other side, only their reflections. Really, really amazing, because this same motif is pictured on gravestones, which we're going to look at in a second. Across the street, this is the side of the Bowman Mausoleum. Mr. Bowman's standing on the top of the stairs right here. This is his house. So from his house, he could look across, literally from his windows into the mausoleum where his family was buried. People that bought this house do not live in it. They say the ghosts force them out and they live in the carriage house next door. Oh, wow. They say that Mr. Bowman still walks around the house. I don't expect you to believe in ghosts. Open your mind to the possibilities. Some people believe, some people aren't going to believe until they see it, but that is the story. All right, so we're going to touch very briefly on portraits in stone. We're getting towards the end of the presentation, and we're going to go out and take a walk. Portraits in stone, as you saw previously in the Old York Burying Ground with Mary Nason, they are very beautiful, and they were quite expensive back in the day. This one's up in Portsmouth. So this is over in Newcastle. It's kind of got a lot of different types of symbolism on it. It's a sea captain's daughter. And here you start to see use of columns, and we're going to get into that in just a minute a little bit more. With the eternal flame, the anchor to denote she's a sea captain's daughter, the angel who's carrying the crown, crowned in the glory of God, and then of course she is fittingly put up on a pedestal. You can see she's raised up on the pedestal. That's the way he felt about her, raising her up on a pedestal. You'll also find there's a bunch of these over in Ipswich. This one's up in Hollis. You'll find a lot of the ministers also had portraits. Well, they tended to be a little more generic, but you'll see the minister's robe. You can see the buttons, and of course, again, the wig, which is just very neat. Then again, we're moving into more of the 1800s, Victorian European influences, like we just saw with the Bowman Mausoleum. You have more of the fenced-off family plots. So those columns that we looked through, as you see, they start to be used in the 19th century. The whole notion is, one thing, you're stepping up into the spiritual world. This is the spirit world that lies beyond these gateposts. So you literally, when you were looking at those pictures of the mausoleum, you were looking into the spiritual world as seen in the mirrors. Now, of course, you have the pointed columns that point skyward, that represent the ascension, sometimes denoted as obelisk. Sometimes you'll see single obelisks in the cemeteries. It's the same thing, pointing up to the ascension. This motif was used everywhere throughout the 19th century. You have the willow tree. The willow tree is a symbol of everlasting life. If you cut the branches off it, it will continue to grow, also bent over in sorrowful mourning. Underneath the willow tree, you have the funerary urn, another really popular motif in the 19th century. If you've ever watched the shows on the History Channel or Discover, when they go into the old ancient pyramids in Egypt, one thing you'll notice when they go into the burial tomb is they'll walk past these obelisks, which flank either side of the door of the tomb. And then, of course, the urns were very important to the Egyptians at the time because they were used in the mummification process. All the vital organs of the body would be removed and stored in these urns for the afterlife. So here you have all this really deep, ancient symbolism now. Now we're going way, way back, further than Puritan times. We're going back, you know, to Victorian, as I said, influences of Egyptology. So here, passing through the gates, ascending to heaven, mourning everlasting life. As I said, you can find that here and all throughout New England. These gates are at the Russell Colbath Historic Site, which is up on the King of Mings Highway. And the gates are symbolic too. If you look, these are harps, symbolizing heaven. And if you look, these are arrows, pointing to heaven. So in the 19th century, what a sweet little, again, melancholy picture we have here. So a young lady who is 19 years old, using that flora and fauna symbology here, you can see the angel is coming along, breaking the bud, symbolizing her young life. Much like the raspberries and strawberries, here we're moving into the same symbology, just slightly different. Note the tiny, petite feet on the angel. You'll find a lot of wreaths also during this time frame. Evergreens, again, symbol of everlasting life. Your pinwheels have now kind of moved on and grown into these wreaths. Same symbol though, that circular energy symbol. Find a lot of mourning cloths, drapery, shrouds on a lot of the graves. This is in Saco, Maine. You can see now instead of the heart being up over the death's head, the hands just raising it up to the heavens, the soul, for dear sweet William. So this is a rare one that I found, 1827, in her 100th year. That means she was born in 1727, when most women live to be like in their 40s, of her stone. A lot of children are depicted as sleeping. During Victorian times, sleep is the tie between life and death. Children are purity and innocence. You'll find on a lot of the stones it'll just say, I am asleep, just sleeping. One of the most interesting graves I visited was up in Magnolia, Massachusetts, just outside of Gloucester, the Hammond Castle. The gentleman who built the castle is buried right on site, although he has been disinterred. I highly recommend a visit to this amazing place. It's right on the ocean. It is a replica of a 16th century castle. He was a man of the 20th century. He held almost as many patents as Edison. Edison was really the man he looked up to. He made his fortune in radio waves and energy waves and things of that nature. So he was very interested in what happened after death. And you'll find very strange artifacts in the castle, like this amazing Roman sarcophagus. It's like from the year 2 BC. I don't know where you get something like that, but he has it in the castle. And on the left is the skull, because he said he was a great explorer. He wanted to have a great explorer in the castle, so that is the skull of a man who actually sailed with Christopher Columbus. He has on display. And there are hundreds of gargoyles throughout the castle, symbols of protection. And there's Mr. Hammond, buried at the back of the castle. Now, unfortunately, he was buried really now off the property. He had this very interesting chamber constructed, and he had all of his cats preserved in formaldehyde and put in his tomb. And there was actually a lock and key on the inside of his tomb should he want to come out after death. But because the castle required a lot of upkeep and a lot of money, unfortunately, the organization had to sell off the property, had him disinterred and reinterred against his wishes right behind the castle, and now there's a house on the property. But they say that his spirit still roams the area, as do many ghost cats. But very interesting for a very spiritualist man. I highly recommend you do some homework on him. He's very, very fascinating. So quickly, a couple other stories in stone, just to kind of whet your appetite. If you come across something like this, with or without the fence around it, this is called a table stone. Table stones really gained favor throughout New England, especially during the 1700s. You may find some from the 1600s and certainly some from the 1800s. The whole notion is that these were reserved for folks that were a little more important than the average you or I. Typically, sea captains, clergy, judges. The whole notion was that they were being raised up over everybody else because they were more important. Unfortunately, because snow and all the New England weather and things like that, they destroy the legs of the table stone, so sometimes you'll just find them lying on the ground. This is Valley Cemetery, Manchester, New Hampshire. In the 19th century, cemeteries were preached as places where you would go for a Sunday picnic and take your sweetie. I know it's like, for some people it's like, really? Why would I do that? But remember, these were garden cemeteries. They were beautiful. Beautiful plantings of trees and flowers and shady lanes and all sorts of water features. And now when you go up to the Valley Cemetery, all the water features have been diverted to an underground culvert that empties into the Merrimack River. All the trees are falling down. The mausoleums are covered in graffiti. And some people say the cemetery is haunted. Couldn't imagine why. Yeah. This is the hard side of going to cemeteries. It's very difficult to go and hope to do research when you find things like this. And this happened within the past 10 years. Stones from the 19th century were destroyed with a baseball bat in Exeter, New Hampshire. But Exeter's not alone. This beautiful Newcastle. We've got some broken stones. I don't know if these were vandalized. I know Exeter's was, but they're underneath a bush. We don't know where they go when they're falling apart. Here's a great example. Eastern Cemetery, Portland, Maine. So, picture on the left is early 1900s, picture on the right. It's fairly recent, although they have righted this monument. You almost couldn't even tell it's the same cemetery. It's a very sad story that back during the 19th century when they had their great fire up there in the oldest cemetery in the city, where the founders were buried in the back section of the cemetery in the 1600s, someone had the not so brilliant idea to fill in the foundations of houses that burned down and fill in the back cove with the back third of the cemetery. Bones, coffins, gravestones, and all were dug out from the back of the cemetery. A retaining wall was put in. The cemetery is 2/3 the size what it originally was in the 17th century. Then add the fact that from July 1988 to August 1989, 1,943 gravestones were destroyed in the Eastern and Western Cemetery due to vandalism. Wow. Stones from the 16 and 1700s gone. This is over in Amesbury. This is a new movement. Take the historic, beautiful stone and now make it new. I found these out there too, and I really like this movement of some sort of preservation effort. There's a photograph on the back of the stone on the left. And there's different movements, depending on where you go, of preserving our history in that type of way. For us in New England, we are so lucky to have this type of history around us. I always find that when I have people from the West Coast and they come out for a presentation or a tour and they see things only from the 1800s and they're like, is that really from the 1600s? They've never seen anything 16 or 1700s on the West Coast. That gives you a whole new appreciation. Just walking by here, these are the reason why you're here, why this building's here, why we're all here. The struggles that they fought, the Indian Wars that they survived, the American Revolution, they're our founding fathers. I feel that we have no context of who or where we are without knowing our history, and that's the reason why I started my tours, the reason why I do my writings, and the reason why I do this is for you to walk away with a new appreciation, so thank you. Rowley is very typical of how our original burying grounds were established. They were kind of just placed at, the tops of hills, and certainly here, the front location, and there was really no idea that people might want to come 100 or 200 years later to make beautiful walking paths and ways through. Cemeteries like this were just places to bury the dead. So you'll notice that as you get to the back of the cemetery, when you get into more of the 19th century, you have more of lanes, you have more plantings. But up here, everything's very, very linear, tightly packed. And I will say too, for nearly all cemeteries of this age, you'll find that while there are some areas where there are not gravestones, most likely there are people that are buried there. And sometimes because their gravestones have fallen apart, sometimes because they had wooden planks, sometimes because they never had any gravestones. You'll also find that in cemeteries of the same age, you had areas where there were no gravestones, often because there were outbreaks of like smallpox. Or you would also have areas of, you know, people who worked in the poorhouse, and they certainly couldn't afford anything. So as you walk through, do know that you're most likely walking over people throughout this entire front section of the cemetery, although you don't see any grave markers. And a lot of these cemeteries stopped being used, and they broke out into newer cemeteries due to overcrowding, simply because they were burying more people and running out of space. So keep that in mind as we walk around. And the other thing that I would like to address before we go in is a couple of things. Have respect for the gravestones. They are way older than we'll ever hope to be, and it's just a miracle that they're still standing here. And for those of you that are worried about walking on the graves of some people, that's the other big concern I get from people while I'm walking on their grave. Again, the key word is respect. Just have respect for the dead, the stones, and the fact that we're in such a great old burying ground. I have a partner in crime that I just met here who is also a great expert on this burial ground. So what we've kind of talked about doing is I'm going to talk a little bit about the symbolism on the stones, much like we talked in the presentation, and then he's going to give you a little bit of the history of the folks that are buried here as well. I think together we'll do a fine job.
1639, town of Raleigh was settled. By 1640, they had established the cemetery. The first burial is recorded in 1641. No marker. The oldest gravestone, and it's down towards the front part of the cemetery, is 1690. Captain Moses Bradstreet. It's unreadable at this time because of due to the weather, as you've said. But luckily we had a fellow by the name of Blodgett in 1892 realized that these inscriptions were disappearing, and he put together a book. And all the inscriptions are in this book. And it covers the front section of the cemetery here. When we get down to the front, it's kind of a unique situation in that the first two rows in the cemetery are newer stones. And what happened was the state actually narrowed the road and gave the land back to the town. And the town moved the cemetery out 2 rows to take up that extra space.
Nice, nice. Well, and you'll find too throughout New England, especially back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, if roads were coming through, if houses were being built, cemeteries were not given a lot of consideration, and we did lose a lot of them due to things like that. I mean, in Portsmouth, we have a huge colonial cemetery for Africans, and they're all underneath the foundations of houses because they built a road over the cemetery. There's over 300 people that are buried there. When you drive down the street, until last week, there was nothing to tell you that those people were there, and that cemetery was established in 1705. So again, keep in mind how these places shift. A lot of moss, a lot of lichens that really attach itself to the gravestones depending on, you know, what sort of vernal conditions you have, and it makes it really difficult to read some of them. But some here are really quite amazing, and I want to show you some back here. So here we're looking at a bit of the resurrection here. You've got the cherub's head, but you can see we've got more of those sad faces. And again, sometimes it's just the outlook of the stone carver themselves, or sometimes it typifies the beliefs of the time. But again, here you have all of the design, but unfortunately you can see we have a big crack here, and it really doesn't take much for the tops of these stones to come down and the earth to start growing over them. But really nice symbol of the resurrection beliefs here, or the Great Awakening. Here's a death's head over here. You can see on the lunate. On the finials, you have these infinite circles. Cycle of life goes on, birth, life, death, and renewal, all within the circle. And then all the scroll work that goes down along the border here. My suspicion is that this is the same stone carver that has a stone up in Portsmouth. This is the brown stone. If you remember, I talked about the gravestone with the eyes. They kind of followed you around a little bit. My suspicion is it's the same carver. It's the same exact type of design. And again, the brownstone to me seems kind of key. But again, your circles on your finial and then all of your border work that's on here as well. Some of them get quite large and some of them are kind of small. Remember when we were talking about the flora and fauna, especially when it shows to children or young people, they're not depicted as a fully bloomed flower. They're depicted as just as they were, a little bud ready to flower. So here you can see on Mary's grave, she was just a child and she's depicted as just a little bud who never got a chance to open. Really very, very poignant stuff. I'll tell you too about some of the flags that you'll find in the cemeteries. We have flags certainly for the Civil War and the Revolutionary War, but also, especially up in my neck of the woods, and when you're in the colonial burying grounds, if you look at the date on the gravestone and you see a flag and say, wait a minute, this is the 1600s, why is there a flag? Stop and think. Indian Wars. Indian Wars. So you'll find a lot of flags on graves from the 1600s, not because of our later wars, but because of Indian Wars. This is another example here of the Great Awakening. You can see he has the wig which entertained a few of you in the bunch, which is right up here as well. And then moving on to the urn and willow motif over here that we had talked about, the urn, the symbol of everlasting life, and of course the urn, the essence of who you were, preserved forever for the afterlife. Of course, it's also important to note that during the mummification process, the Egyptians did not consider the brain to be a vital organ. So the brain was actually disposed of while all the rest of the organs were collected. It's a cheery thought, I know. We have, you know, everything from frost heaves, which really make it difficult for some of our stones to stand up, and then again, the moisture retention of some of the stones. And one thing to note too, a lot of our stones initially in the 1600s actually came over from England as ballasts in the ships. The stones were used as ballast, and then they would end up making gravestones out of them. One of the big clues in my neck of the woods up in Portsmouth and on the New Hampshire seacoast is if you find any gravestones from the 1600s that are purple in nature, like a purple slate, those are ones that most assuredly came from England. But it really wasn't until the later 1600s that they started to quarry stones locally. And of course, brown stones, depending on where these people actually came from, brown stones were sometimes shipped in from other parts of New England. All your stone carvers varied as to where the families decided to get the stones from. They certainly could have decided to get it from the local stone carver, but if they had family in Boston, they may have commissioned the stone in Boston and had it shipped up here to be used. Now, one thing I do also want to mention, when you're looking at the artwork, especially like this one here, is very, very startling almost. It's almost on the scheme of a pumpkin head here with the jack-o'-lantern style face. That these types of images were also drawn on the neck of the horse that bared the funeral cart. They would draw it in like a black chalk, so that way it denoted that it was a funeral cart. They also, in some towns that I've read, they would sew it into the pall or the cloth that actually hung over the coffin itself. Not to mention, especially in the more wealthy communities, those types of designs, even the urns and willows and the angels, were made into mourning jewelry, and sometimes the mourning jewelry would actually have hair of the deceased woven in it. And of course, it was a very interesting aspect and a point for a lot of people to let you know how much mourning jewelry that they had from attending all these funerals, because it meant to say that they knew a lot of people. They could have been very prestigious, even powerful in the community. And these things were collected like trophies and shown off like that. So these images were not only in the cemetery, but transcended in other ways as well. In the 19th century, they collected the tears because it was thought that you would continue to mourn for the deceased, and when the tears dried up, your period of mourning was over. Oh, there's all sorts of interesting customs and beliefs of the time. So you can see here we've got some more of the brownstone. Unfortunately, you know, stones like this that get broken, you always wonder where the other half of it went, if it's actually there underneath all of the grass. And I know in different parts of the United States, they actually have thermal cameras that they go over cemeteries with, and they can point out where some of the remains are. They've found stones, all sorts of different things, so it's really quite amazing. So this is a really nice cluster that's up in this particular area. This is one, if you remember, I showed you stones in Concord, and we talked a little bit about the hex signs here. You can see here, we've got 2 hex signs. This stone is 1732, and then on the finials we've got the hex signs, and again that really spiritual type of face there, almost primitive in a sort, but still an image that people would recognize. Even if they couldn't read the inscription here on the captain's grave, they certainly knew what the imagery meant. So it's important to note too, when you're looking at gravestones and reading the wording that's on it, there was not a standardized form of spelling or wording. There was not proper grammar back in the day, so you're going to find all sorts of interesting spellings on there. Doesn't mean that they're wrong, it doesn't mean that they made a mistake, but there really wasn't an emphasis put on proper English grammar as we know it. So you'll find a variety of wordings that are out there on the gravestones. It's not an error, it's just kind of a nice flavor for the way it was back in the day.
How did they get this so smooth on both sides? They have to chip that out?
They did. There was no soft machines to do that by.
Yeah. The inscription on this particular stone is, "Here lies ye body of Captain Ezekiel Northern, who died December the 23rd, 1732, in ye 66th year of his age."
Really amazing, and when you start looking at some of the graves in the front and realize that these men were born in the 1500s, that really throws things in quite a perspective. You can't read them, but these may very well be footstones. They're in the perfect angle here, and the imaginary lines would work. Interesting that the monument would have been erected right over where the bodies were laying, but all in the interest of space too. But these do look like 2 footstones to the headstones.
This was the monument was put up 1865,
Sure.
erected by his descendants,
Right.
Joseph of Boston and one of Baltimore, Maryland also.
Sure. So that's why it's in the middle of the plot. A lot of families did that, especially if they had notable descendants. So can you tell us a little bit about the Lambert family here?
Thomas Lambert. Thomas Lambert lived in that house right across the street. That's the Lambert house, goes back to 1690. And the old Thomas started 1793. Up until maybe about 10 or 15 years ago, it was still in the Lambert family.
Wow.
It is on the National Register of Historic Places.
Oh, sure.
Yep. And actually the land that the library is on was actually given by Mrs. Lambert.
Oh, nice.
Actually, her name was Ruth Lambert Cheney. And that land was set aside for the use of a library, and there had to be a garden that went with it. And as you notice out on the side,
Yes.
there was a garden.
Yeah.
And that was part of her will.
Oh, I love it. Wonderful.
So it was the fact
There's
that she
actually-
gave us the land.
There's a stone monument that we put out in the garden thanking Mrs. Cheney for her gift.
Right.
It's broken right now.
Oh.
So even new stones.
We've got a lot of Jewitts up in our neck of the woods.
There's
one
Jewitts
Jewett
everywhere.
No,
with
those
3
are my
wives.
ancestors all through here.
He has 3 wives.
And what is interesting with the Jewett family is the Jewett family in America was the ones that came with Ezekiel Rogers. And the stone is right over there, right between those 2
Fine fence with the little fence.
That was Maximilian and Joseph. Joseph and Maximilian Jewett came with Rogers. And all of the Jewitts in America today are descended from those 2 gentlemen. To the point where almost every 5 years the Jewish Society of America comes to Rowley to celebrate it because of that heritage.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
I'm proud of that. I'm pretty proud of that.
You should be. You should be.
This stone here, you actually have a carving of the body interred. So you could picture that this, of course, is the coffin and the body lying inside. Depending on where you go in New England, you'll find this throughout a lot of the cemeteries, that singular body that's in there. Sometimes you'll see this in 2 or 3, this particular design. I didn't see an awful lot of these in here, so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to make note of that, so you can see the different types of styles. Most of these did date from around the Resurrection in the 18th century, and it's just really just another interesting design. And coffins typically were made from the trunk of a tree. They cut out the entire trunk of a tree, and then they'd place the body in it and put a couple of planks over the top. In the 19th century, again, depending on where you are in New England, sometimes there was a little window that was left open in the coffin so you could look in at the deceased. But most likely, eventually, they were, of course, closed in. It's also important to note that when you go back and look at some epidemics during the 19th century, sometimes those epidemics were actually passed on by the deceased. Those who were carrying the coffins to the burial place would sometimes bend down to place the coffin, of course, in the ground and breathe in what they called was the breath of death. They'd breathe in the air, especially, you know, around people that had consumption, and they would catch it themselves. So burying people was also very risky as well. And you can find vital statistics in every state of people who, of course, were coming to cemeteries and getting ill from burying the deceased as well. So it's really, the more you look into it, the more you find.
Roxy,
Yes,
oldest stone in the cemetery at this point.
excellent.
Thank you. This one right here. Dates back to 1690. And it is, here lies what was model of ye worthy Captain Moses Bradstreet, deceased August ye 17th, 1690, in ye 47th year of his age. Friends and relatives you might behold, a Lamb of God, fit for ye fold. And that's a stone right there. This particular stone here, as we can see, it's encased in concrete. It's a Bailey stone. Mr. Bailey was in the brick making business. This particular stone is made out of brick.
Yeah, it's got beautiful lettering on it. Really, really nice. Hammer and chisel. Hammer and chisel, not too bad.
In memory of Deacon David Bailey, who died May 12th, 1769, in 62 years of his age.
Interesting. Yeah, that's very different.
These are most of the ministers.
Yes.
Phillips, Samuel Phillips, which was the second minister. The one over here depicts Ezekiel Rogers and some of his people. He was the first minister. He was the founder of the town. And that stone used to be over next to that tree stump. And what happened was when the tree died, there was another tree, it was a beech tree like this.
Oh, wow.
That passed away. And the root system, this kind of stone started to chip.
Okay.
So they got kind of nervous about it. Actually, this stone was put in 1849, 1850, something like that, by the church to do the recognition.
Sure, sure.
So it was about probably 10 years ago. They actually moved it and put it over there, put a new foundation in it. Dismantled the thing, and I actually have a dime in there with the year on it. It's underneath the stone.
Oh, no kidding. Oh, how cool.
And one of the other things that I was able to salvage was when they put stones like that together, they're in pieces. So they put lead shims between them, so when they set the stone down, the lead will squeeze out and actually automatically level the stone. Well, the old lead shims, they had just kind of brushed them aside, and I picked them up and saved them.
Good for you.
So I've got the original lead shims that were in that stone when it was put in the 1820s.
Oh, that's great.
It says Ezekiel Rogers, First Minister of Rowley, born in Wethersfield, Essex County, England, AD 1590. A minister in Rowley, Yorkshire, 17 years, came to this place with his church and flock in April 1639, died June 23rd, 1660.
Well, that had a good long life at that time. At a very
And
tough
he
time of
actually-
settlement.
60 people were on that boat he
I
brought
don't know
over.
where it came from. That's amazing.
Yeah. And then of course there's the Reverend Samuel Shepherd that's on that. The Reverend Phillips, I believe, is on this one over here. Their wives' names are here. Reverend Mr. Phillips, Dorothy Flint, his wife. Reverend Edward Payson, 4th Minister. Elizabeth Phillips and Elizabeth Appleton were his wives. Reverend Jonathan Jewett,
There you go.
5th
You're in.
Minister.
I'm a pastor too, so.
5th Minister of
bloodline
Valley,
kept
born
going.
in 1705, ordained in 1729. Also his wives, Elizabeth Dummer and Elizabeth Parsons, liked Elizabeth.
Oh yeah.
Reverend Ezekiel Bradford, 6th Minister, and Elizabeth Green, his wife.
Wow.
So,
Well, it is getting a little dark and shady in here to see a lot more. But I really invite you to come back and explore the other side of the burying ground, and certainly down in the back. You'll kind of move through the eras as we talked about in the presentation tonight. You'll have more of the 17th century, and then when you come back to the very end there, you'll be in the 19th century. And it's really like moving through all the different types of carvings that we talked about, the inscriptions and the epitaphs that are over there. Some of them are quite startling, and when you think about it, that's really the word of the dead that you're reading on a lot of these gravestones. That's how they're remembered. And you know, reader, cast an eye, this could be you that's down here. Again, that whole notion of mortality on the gravestone. So I remember there were quite a few nice inscriptions over there. I invite you to come back and take a look at them. I appreciate your assistance this evening and going through the burying ground. But isn't this great? I mean, imagine 300 years ago, who would have been standing here? There would have been no lights, no cars, no street. We would have been out here with a couple of oxen walking through the burying ground and who knows what else in just our little tight-knit communities, because that's how we survived back then. And when you think about it now, we've gotten so far away from, you know, knowing our neighbor and having that community. If you want to come back and find that sense of community, come back to the cemetery. That's how they survived.